Good evening, good evening, good evening, and good evening. My name is Funton Daniel. Uh, there are many pertinent questions that we Africans have to ask ourselves. And that is the questions that I am posting to the general Africa. Not as a Southern Cameroon, not as a US citizens, but in general, Africans as a whole. The question is, who actually rule Africa, France or Africans? Those are many pertinent questions that I am going to be talking about this evening, and I want you to share whenever you come across these messages. Share it as soon as possible. But the key question is the actors of Africa. And one most important is the African ambassador to the United Nations. The reason why I ask who rule Africa is pertinent to this African ambassador that is an outspoken at the United Nations. She recently was issued a termination letters by the current OAU Secretary General. Let's look who that person is. The current OAU Secretary General. That is the OAU Secretary General. He issued a termination letters to the current U.S. African ambassador to the United Nations, which I just showed her pictures. And currently, the outspoken OAU chairman, Paul Kagame. And you all know about him. He's a well-known person. He has carried on a series of reform in his own country as a whole. But he can't do everything by himself. But as a current OAU chairperson and the Secretary General of the OAU, why will Africa, European Union are not ruled by Africa. European Union are not ruled by Africa. European Union are ruled by Europeans. And they do not have influence from Africa to determine who should be an European ambassador to the United Nations. Why must France determine who should be an African ambassador to the United Nations? Simply because she spoke her real mind. Let's listen to some of her messages and then we move from there. You all listen. That is the current African ambassador to the United Nations. She was terminated from her positions because France asked the currently OAU Secretary General to terminate her position simply because she expressed her mind. He speaks the truth, and that is why she was asked to be terminated by France. So therefore, despite the fact that at this 20th century, we still believe, Africans still believe, that they must take instruction from France. I am bringing this attention to our fellow Africans that even whether you are an African that born here in the United States, whether you are an African living in Africa, whether you are an African or whatever it is, this is the plain truth. We are still, despite the fact that at this 20th century, 21st century, we haven't grown up maturely. We still believe that we must be conquered and controlled by France. Let's take, for example, an African left Africa. He traveled to France and he wanted to work in a gold manufacturing in France. And after he accepted and he was working in that gold manufacturing, he realized that the material that are being used are transported from Africa by the French military. Take this clear. The gold that is being manufactured in France are gold that have been transported from Africa by the French military to be processed in France. So in other words, the French military extracted mineral in Africa, in which they claim they are providing assistance, military aid and military assistance. And that is why you see France keep on protecting dictators in Africa, because the interest of France is a top priority, because they are protecting the interests of France by maintaining access for mineral deposit in Africa that provide access for French military currently stationed in Africa to transport all those minerals to be produced in France for the interest of France. And that is why you see France continue protecting dictatorship for their own self-interest. And that is why you can see that France requests the OAU Secretary General to immediately and unconditionally stop her, immediately terminate her position as the African spokesperson to the United Nations. Are we in the 19th century, fellow Africans, if you're watching this video? Are we still in the 20th century? In the 18th century? Of course not. We should be able to rise and stand against France's interest in Africa. We must rise and stand as a protectorate over France against the exploitation of Africa. You can imagine that an ambassador of an African to the United Nations and France asking the OAU to terminate her position for France's self-interest rather than the interest of Africa. This is absolutely pathetic. Okay, let's look. When I talk about France, I'm sure you wonder who I'm speaking. I'm speaking directly to Emmanuel Macron. Africa has to rise. Africa has to rise and grow matured and be able to protect their own interests rather than the interests of France. Imagine that young guy that traveled maybe by sea and managed to get to France, only to discover that working in a gold industry, those gold material are extracted from where he came from. And now he is going to be working in France to be paid a meager France, and that material are now being stationed in his country of origin, where he traveled several distance to France. He could have died. He could have perished on the sea, only to discover that the mineral that he wanted to work in, the industry that manufactured gold, is actually from his country, where he migrated 1,000 miles to arrive in France, that are being transported by the French military. What a miracle. Let's look at Africa. That why Africa must rise to the 21st century. Let's look. This is the current OAU Secretary General. It is with absent mind that he will be instructed specifically to terminate as representative, a spokesperson for Africa, try to voice the concern for Africa, and he will choose France's instruction. Africa has a long way to go. That is how they stand. Africa still have a long way to decide. And this is what my recommendations. Africa in the diaspora, we need to call a conference of Africa in the diaspora, reject all African leaders that is currently in plenary sessions, and decide the future of Africa. We cannot allow this to continue over time. It's time we need to come together and decide what do we want the direction of Africa as a whole. And this is absolutely imperative. Let's look. Who actually rule Africa? France or Africa themselves? That is the pertinent questions. You all know what is going on in Southern Cameroon territory. Southern Cameroon territory has witnessed a massacre that is going on by a French-sponsored Paul Biya regime in Africa to massacre Africa. You know that he initially contacted Chad to send their militiamen in Southern Cameroon territory. He tried to work with Nigeria to form a buffer zone against the people of Southern Cameroon, just simply because they want to keep the oil refinery that are used to exploit for the interest of France. Oil is cheaper in France than it is cheaper in Africa, where the mineral actually are being gotten uprooted by the French for the interest of France, and then Africa are living in the mingling. And that is why Putin, the Russian president, that the mineral deposit in Africa is more than what Europe has, and yet Europe is richer. It's because he gives a very contrast indication, which is perfectly, absolutely right. Africa must rise. It's time Africa must rise and stand against colonialism. It is important, it is imperative that Africa must rise and stand against colonialism. I just want to take a moment to thank